of Lamed Zayin Amud Beis 37b. Now, the conversation we've been having is about matzah that has another designation to it as well. Matzah that's teruma, matzah that's ma'aser sheni, the second tithe, whether you can fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with that. Also, bikurim, etc. The Gemara is going to go back to Maser Sheni, the second tithe, which the halacha is that you have to bring it to Yerushalayim and eat it in Yerushalayim, and you can't eat it elsewhere. And it has a kedusha on it, a certain sanctity that wherever you are, you have to first redeem it onto a coin in order to eat it. And then when you bring it to Yerushalayim, you use the coins to buy food, and that itself becomes the same sanctity as Maser Sheni. There's a machlokas in the Gemara in Kiddushin of whether or not Meiser Sheni Mammon Gava, the fact that the Torah sanctified Meiser Sheni, the second tithe, and obligates you to bring it to Yerushalayim, makes it a certain level of ownership by Hashem or by sanctity. And so it's not yours entirely, because you can't just do what you want with it. You have to eat it in Yerushalayim, and you have to eat it in a certain state of mind, in a certain place, in a certain way. It can't be tameh. You can't eat it when you're in mourning. So the sanctity, the kedusha of this produce is such that it elevates it, that it's not yours. It's mammon gava. It's money from up high. Or do we say that no, even though that you have mitzvahs and obligations to do with them, or limits to how to eat it, it nevertheless is your own produce, your own money. And this distinction is going to be important in various halachas. So we are in the second to last line of Lamed Zayin Amud Beis. Amar Rav Asi. Rav Asi says, Isa shel ma'aser sheni. If somebody made a dough with produce, with wheat, barley, etc., from the Ma'aser Sheni, he'd taken the 10% tithe and brought it up to Yerushalayim. That 10% tithe that he took is, according to Rabbi Meir, not his anymore. It's mammon gava. Because of the sanctity, because of the kedusha of this produce, it now belongs to up high, and it's not his own money. And so if he needs a dough with the flour from this, he's going to be exempt to challah, as the Gemara is going to tell us soon, that it says in regards to dough of challah, arisa sechem, your arisa, your dough, which limits that it has to be yours, not somebody else's. If a non-Jew has a partnership in it, and also is going to limit, according to Rabbi Meir, Ma'aser Sheni, because it's not yours, it's mammon gavoa. However, l'divrei chachamim chayevas b'chala. But according to the chachamim, even though that there are mitzvahs, it is still your money. It's still considered yours, and therefore, when you get to Yerushalayim and you eat it, you can make dough of it. And when you make a dough of it, you're obligated to take challah because it is considered your dough. Now we go to Lamed Ches Amud Aleph at the top. Similarly, matzos shel ma'aser sheni, the matzah on the first night of Pesach. You cannot fulfill your obligation with it of the first night of Pesach. And besides, for what we already saw, the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who says that since it's called lechem oni, poor bread, that you can't, and Maser Sheni, you have to make a statement that I didn't eat it in mourning, and this is this would be the opposite of matzah, which is a poor man's or affliction bread. So a bread of mourning, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that tells us already you can't eat Maser Sheni matzah in order to fulfill your obligation on the first night of Pesach. Rabbi Meir would hold for another reason, as we'll see soon, that he compares the matzah to challah, and just as challah needs to be yours, so too this needs to be yours. Matzah needs to be yours. And it's not yours because Ma'aser Sheni is mammon gava. It belongs to up high. L'divrei chachamim. However, the chachamim say that Ma'aser Sheni does belong to you. You can fulfill your obligation on Pesach. Similarly, esrog shel Ma'aser Sheni l'divrei Rabbi Meir in Adam Yetzeh esrog. On the first day of Sukkot, where you have to take a esrog that belongs to you, l'kachtem lachem miyom harishon, you shall take for yourself a fruit, esrog, if it belongs to Ma'aser Sheni, then it's not yours. It's mammon gavoa, according to Rabbi Meir. The Chachamim say, L'divrei Chachamim, Adam yetzev dei chavasi b'Pesach b'Yontif. A person can fulfill his obligation on Sukkot with an esrog of Ma'aser Sheni. So we now had these three items. A dough, are you obligated to take a challah? Does it count as yours? Matzah, can you fulfill your mitzvah with Ma'aser Sheni? Does it count as yours? And esrog, can you fulfill your mitzvah with Ma'aser Sheni? A second time, esrog, does it count as yours? Maskif la Rav Papa. So Rav Papa challenged this statement of Rav Asi, who listed these three. Bishlama Isa, arisa sechem. So by dough, I get it. It says arisa sechem. It has to be your dough, mishalachem. It has to be yours, and therefore you're not going to fulfill your obligation with the dough of Ma'aser Sheni because it's not yours according to Rabbi Meir. And the Chachamim say it is yours. Esrog nami dechsivul kachtem lachem mishalachem. By esrog, it also says al kachtem lachem. You will take for yourselves on the first day. The Priyei Tzadar kapas tamarim esrog lulav. So it has to be mishalachem. And according to Rabbi Meir, in Mishalachem Yehei, and according to Rabbi Meir, this is not yours because this Ma'aser Sheni belongs to Apai. Ela matzah, miksiv matzaschem. But in matzah, does it say anywhere it has to be matzaschem, your matzah? I can't fulfill matzah with somebody else's matzah. Amar Rav Avitema Rav Yemer bar Shalamia, Asya lechem lechem. It says, indeed, it doesn't say by matzah that it has to be yours, but it does say that it has to be lechem, bread. Lechem and it calls challah also lechem haaretz. Ksiv hacha lechem oni. Ksiv hasam v'haya ba'acholchem mi lechem haaretz. It says here that it is lechem oni, and a bread of affliction or poor bread, and it says over there that you will eat of lechem haaretz. Malahala mishalachem, just as over there by challah, the Torah clearly says arisa sechem. It has to be your dough, your kneading of your dough. Afkan mishalachem. So too over here, it has to be yours. And so we learn that matzah, just like challah, has to be yours. And the poskim deal with this question. So does that mean a guest has to bring their own matzah? They can't eat at the host's matzah? And of course, halacha is that you can. The question is, do you have to own the matzah? Or is the permission to eat it sufficient to say that this is yours? That's included in the invitation. Once you take it in your hands, is it now essentially yours? So nevertheless, obviously the halacha is that that's fine, but there is an aspect of mishalachem that's required in matzah. It has to be yours. Lema Messiah. Let's say that we can prove this from this brisa. The brisa says, Isa shall Ma'aser Sheni Pturim in Achala Divrei Rabbi Meir. So it clearly says that Rabbi Meir says a dough of Ma'aser Sheni is exempt of Chala, and v'chachamim and rechayeves. Someone says, wait, are you trying to prove the idea of matzah or the idea of Ravasi? Lema Messiah Hainach. You have nothing more. This is exactly what Ravasi said. Hachikamer. This is what it means to say that. Lema, let us say, do we say that we can support from this the entire statement of Ravasi? And just as by dough, it explicitly is a machlokas between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. And Rabbi Meir says that you cannot fulfill the obligation of challah, or you're not obligated in taking challah, on account of that the dough is not yours, even though it's yours. But it's not yours because it's Ma'aser Sheni and you have to take it to Yerushalayim and it has specific halachas, and so therefore it is Mishal Gavoya, it is from up high. And therefore the same would apply to Matzah and Esrog. Or do we say no? Really, Rabbi Meir would agree that Ma'aser Sheni is yours. And even though that it is Mammon Gavaya, it's enough to fulfill your obligation as your matzah and your esrog. And it's only by dough, where the Torah says multiple times, Arisa Seichem, your dough. So the Torah specifically wants it to be yours and limits it that way. So one is going to be limit the obvious ways it's not yours, where it's actually not yours. You borrowed it, you stole it. So clearly there it's not yours. But even the second one is to tell you even when it is yours, but it's yours with a limit, where the Torah elevated it and limits halachically what you're allowed to do with it, or where you're allowed to eat it, or how you're allowed to eat it, or when you're allowed to eat it. Oh, so there too it would be excluded. But indeed, in regards to matzah and in regards to esrog, Ma'aser Sheni would count as yours, and that's the question. So the statement of Ravasi stays, and the Gemara has a question whether or not we have a proof from this other text as well. The Gemara is now going to go into another discussion that we had earlier in regards to the statement of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, where we had said that Ma'aser Sheni has an exemption. The Ma'aser Sheni has an exemption on account of not like Rabbi Meir, Rabasi said in the name of Rabbi Meir, because it's not yours, but rather, as we said before, because the Ma'aser Sheni has to be eaten. You have to make a statement and say, I didn't eat it in affliction, but I didn't eat it in affliction. And matzah is an affliction bread. I didn't eat it in mourning, really, and this is an affliction bread. Rabbi Yossi, that's one version. Another idea we saw was that Ma'aser Sheni and by Bikurim, that matzah also has to be eaten b'chol moshvesechem. Matzah is an obligation. We saw this a couple of daf back. Since the Torah says that you shall eat matzah in all of your dwelling places, it has to be the type of bread that is permissible to be eaten b'chol moshvesechem everywhere. So, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, it doesn't make a difference whether or not you can eat it anywhere. But according to the idea of that it has to be eaten anywhere, we explain that Ma'aser Sheni has an opportunity to eat it elsewhere as well. Even though we just said that you have to eat it in Yerushalayim, that is true. But before you bring it to Yerushalayim, you can redeem it and onto a coin and then bring the coin to Yerushalayim. And even after you brought it to Yerushalayim, once it became tamei, you're allowed to bring it outside of Yerushalayim. So that's true, and that would give all of Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithe, opportunity or possibility of being eaten outside of Yerushalayim, anywhere where your home is, and therefore the halacha is that you can fulfill your obligation of matzah with Ma'aser Sheni. But there are certain things that once they became tamei, you can no longer take them out of Yerushalayim, or you can no longer take it anyway. You have to burn it, and we'll see in the Gemara now. And the Gemara asks, if that's the case, do we then say that you cannot fulfill your obligation of matzah with that because it is both Ma'aser Sheni, which has a limit that it has to be in Yerushalayim, and the only way you can take it out of Yerushalayim is if it became tamei. And once it becomes tamei, because it has the other sanctity, it has to be burned. It can't be eaten. So you'll never have the opportunity to eat it outside of Yerushalayim. That's the question. So, Ba'i Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Rish Lakish asked the question: Mahu sheyetze adam yidecha vasek? Can a person fulfill his obligation for eating matzah the first night of Pesach, b'chala shel Ma'aser Sheni b'Yerushalayim, having taken Ma'aser Sheni up to Yerushalayim? So he took his wheat to Yerushalayim, grinds it up, makes a dough, separates the dough, and as challah. And so this separated challah now has two sanctities. It is Ma'aser Sheni in Yerushalayim. It is also challah. And this person's a kohen, and he's going to eat this challah as his obligation in matzah. Aliba de Rabbi Yossi Aglili, the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yosef Glili, that says the reason you cannot eat, you cannot fulfill your mitzvah of matzah, eating Ma'aser Sheni, because you have to eat it. You have to make a statement with Ma'aser Sheni saying, Lo chalti mimenu b'oini. I did not eat it while afflicted or while in mourning. And that's a contradiction to lechem oni, to the poor bread, to the bread of affliction. Of course, hashtag bechulin loynafik. Even if it's not challah, just regular Ma'aser Sheni, you cannot fulfill the obligation of matzah with. With the separated challah from it, for sure not. So where is the question? Aliba de Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbi Akiva, said no, you can fulfill your obligation of matzah with Ma'aser Sheni, and he says that the bread of affliction just means that it has to be poor bread, that you can't use wine and oil in the bread. It has to be just flour and water. But it doesn't mean that you're actually in mourning. It's not it's something that's afflicting you now, and therefore you can eat Ma'aser Sheni, and it's not considered eating it in affliction. So according to Rabbi Akiva, b'chulin hu denafik. So perhaps if it's not just simple Ma'aser Sheni, you can fulfill the obligation denafik. And what's the reason? Because since it became tummy, if it were to become tummy, the imitmu yesh lahem hetem ha'moshavos. If it were to become tummy, you're allowed to take it back out of Yerushalayim and eat it wherever you are. So therefore, it applies to b'chol mashvasechem. This is a bread. This is a matzah that is technically or in some circumstances allowed to be eaten in everywhere in the country, in your home. And so it's an equal opportunity matzah, and so you're allowed to eat it. Avo challah, the imitamia. But challah, now that you've taken this dough, made dough out of the Ma'aser Sheni, and separated challah away, so you have this matzah that is not only Ma'aser Sheni, the second tithe, but it's double sanctity. It also is now challah, which is a type of teruma which you have to give to the kohen. So the kohen may eat it, but once it becomes tamei, no one's allowed to eat it. You cannot bring it and eat it elsewhere. In fact, l'sreifa asla, since it's essentially a type of teruma that became tamei, you're not allowed to benefit from it. Well, actually, that's incorrect. You're not allowed to eat it. Right? And we saw earlier that teruma tamei is allowed to be used as fuel. So you're not allowed to eat it. So since you're not allowed to eat this challah if it became tummy, and the only way you can take it out of Yerushalayim to all of your dwelling places is if it did become tummy. So the concept that we said earlier, that the Torah obligates that it should be a matzah that could go l'moshavos to all of your dwelling places. This matzah actually, in the current state, where it's Ma'aser Sheni, that's also challah, that's teruma, you can't take it out of Yerushalayim. You could take it out of Yerushalayim if it were to become tummy. But if it became tummy, you can no longer eat it. So you can never have this matzah that's edible at your home. So, sorry? Go ahead.
So it's challah was taken out of Ma'aser Sheni, and it became tummy. So you couldn't eat it, and you couldn't take it out of Yerushalayim. But if you could be nenet from it, why couldn't you sell it? Why couldn't you be paid it?
Why couldn't you what?
Why couldn't you be paid it? Chalat Ma'aser Sheni Tameya. Why couldn't you be paid it? So you could be paid
you have to burn it.
Good. So another coin could be paid. You could be paid it.
But what are you going? You can't fulfill the obligation. The Torah says in all of your dwelling places you should eat matzah. This is not edible in your dwelling place. You can no longer eat it.
Ma'aser Sheni, you'd have to. So
it's not edible in your dwelling place. I think you're asking that. Look, but there's something you could do with it. You can use it as fuel. That's right.
Right.
But the definition that was given a couple of days ago was that it has to be matzah that's edible in all your dwelling places. The Torah tells us in all your dwelling places to tell you it has to be a matzah that you can eat anywhere. this matzah you're only allowed to eat in Yerushalayim, right? Because it's Ma'aser Sheni. So we said, no, well, actually, there is a way out. You can redeem it and eat it at home when it became tummy. But actually, this particular piece, if it became tummy, it has to be burnt. It cannot be eaten at all. So you can never have this edible at your home.
Could be edible. Got it.
Right. Dilma, or perhaps Amrin and Hayil, we say a concept of since, if you were, we say if you had not pronounced this as challah, and it had become tummy, you would be able to bring it anywhere and eat it. In other words, the rest of this dough that's not pronounced as challah, you could take and eat anywhere. And therefore you could fulfill your obligation of matzah with it. Hashtanami nafik, so too now you can fulfill your obligation with it. Now there's a concept of hoil, there's a concept of that I don't have to look at the practical of the situation, but rather with the conceptual. And this is the idea of we're not looking at the practical situation here, whether you can take this and eat it at home, but rather the category. Is the category of matzah, of Ma'aser Sheni, something that you can eat at home? Because after all, if I had not made this into challah, I'd be able to eat it at home if it became tummy. So therefore, the category is one that I can eat at home. There's another, I was going to ask a question for this, but we'll leave that out. It's going to be just make it more confusing. So again, we have Ma'aser Sheni in the second tithe that you've eaten, that you've brought up to Yerushalayim. You can only eat it in Yerushalayim. If it became tummy, you can eat it anywhere else, and therefore it counts as matzah that's equal opportunity. It can be eaten in any home. And even if you separated the part that became challah, which if it became tummy, you cannot eat at home. So currently, this can only be eaten in Yerushalayim, and this particular piece has no opportunity to be eaten at home. But nevertheless, since if I had not pronounced it as challah, I can eat it at home, meaning that intrinsically with Ma'aser Sheni, it's not held back from eating at home. Therefore, and the same is true for challah. Challah, if it wasn't Ma'aser Sheni, can be eaten outside of Yerushalayim, and therefore there's nothing holding it in Yerushalayim per se. No individual thing holding it in Yerushalayim. Ikad Amri, there are those that say the question was asked even further. Oh no, of course. In this case, we would not say hoil. We would say, look, it's Ma'aser Sheni can be eaten at home in certain cases, even though this is not that case yet because it's not tummy. But Ma'aser Sheni that's tummy could be eaten at home. So the limit of Yerushalayim is not a absolute limit, and so it's still applicable to home. And even though that this piece is challah, so what? If I had not called it challah, the Ma'aser Sheni would not be a limit to Yerushalayim. So therefore, Ma'aser Sheni is not a limit to Yerushalayim. So where's the question? Challah halakuach bekesav Ma'aser Sheni. If I had not brought the grains up itself to Yerushalayim, but rather I had transferred onto a coin, and then the halacha is that I take the coins up to Yerushalayim, and I purchase new food with the coins that I had transferred my Ma'aser Sheni onto. And then the Ma'aser Sheni the food that I bought essentially becomes elevated to Ma'aser Sheni, to the second tithe. It could be a piece of meat, but it's elevated to Ma'aser Sheni, even though there's no tithing of meat in this way. But nevertheless, since I transferred my second tithe, my Ma'aser Sheni, onto coins, and the coins now, I purchased this piece of meat. That meat or this bread or whatever it is that I bought would now be elevated to Ma'aser Sheni. And now this food became tummy. So even though we said that Ma'aser Sheni that became tummy, it is no longer limited to Yerushalayim, there is a machlokas if that applies even to the purchased Ma'aser Sheni. In the original Ma'aser Sheni, which started off at home, and I brought it to Yerushalayim, it became Tamei, I can bring it back home. However, if I brought the coins, purchased food, and it became Tamei, there's a machlokas of whether I can bring that back home. So the Gemara says, Aliba, and according to the Rabbanan, no question. And they say that even foods that were purchased with Ma'aser Sheni, with Ma'aser Sheni coins, if they became Tamei, they can be redeemed and brought home. So that's not going to be a question. This matzah is still edible at home. Kivan the Amri Yifta, since they say that you could redeem it, Haina Ma'aser Sheni, it's exactly like regular Ma'aser Sheni. It makes no difference between the original Ma'aser Sheni or the ones that were transferred onto a coin. Then you use the coins to buy food. Either way, it's Ma'aser Sheni. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that no, you're not allowed to, once you've purchased these foods and it became Tamei, you cannot take it out of Yerushalayim, you cannot redeem them, they have to be buried. The Amay Yikaver, the Tanan, as we learned, that which is purchased with the money of Ma'aser Sheni, you can redeem if it became Tamei. However, Yuda Yikaver, no, you cannot redeem them, they have to be buried. So now this food, even as Ma'aser Sheni itself, cannot be taken out of Yerushalayim because it's limited. You can only eat in Yerushalayim, and even if it were to become Tamei, you cannot take it out. You have to eat it here. And now, not only that, you've separated it as challah. So it's the challah of foods that were bought with Ma'aser Sheni. So I'd have to say a double hayil. I'd have to say if I had not purchased this with Ma'aser Sheni and I had not separated the challah, then I would be allowed to take it out of Yerushalayim. Mi amrinan hayil v'iloi lakuach have. If I had not purchased this with Ma'aser Sheni money. And also, if I had not, and I had not pronounced it as challah, and then it became tamei, then I would have been able to bring it home. Yeah, but now there's a double limit on it. Menafik base, therefore I can fulfill the obligation of matzah. Nami nafik base, so hashtanami nafik base, and now too, even though that it is purchased with Ma'aser Sheni money, and it is challah, I've separated it as challah, nevertheless, I can fulfill my obligation with it. Or do we say, no, this is too far-fetched. This is too if I had not, that, or if I had, and we don't say that. And to which Rava said, Rava Amar Rava Mistabra, Shem Ma'aser Chadhu. No, the logic is that Ma'aser itself, you can fulfill your obligation with. And the reason is because Ma'aser is not limited to Yerushalayim intrinsically. Ma'aser by itself is something that you can eat at home. You could take it home if it were to become tamei in its original form. So Ma'aser by definition is not something that is limited to Yerushalayim. There are halachas that limit you. And in this case, you wouldn't be able to take this particular dough home or this particular matzah home. But nevertheless, Ma'aser Sheni as a category is something that you could take home, you can eat at home, and therefore Ma'aser Sheni as a category is all one category, and you can fulfill your obligation with matzah of Ma'aser Sheni, even if you had pronounced it in as challah, and even if you had purchased it with the coins of Ma'aser Sheni, which according to Rabbi Yehuda, even if it became tamei, cannot be taken out of Yerushalayim. It was a little bit complex, but the concept is, according to Rabbi Akiva, according to this opinion, you have to have the reason you're allowed to eat Ma'aser Sheni as matzah is because even though that you're obligated to eat it in Yerushalayim, there are exceptions to the rule. There are that limit of eating in Yerushalayim is not absolute. There are opportunities to eat Ma'aser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim. And therefore, even if in this particular case you cannot, Ma'aser Sheni is one category, and that category is not limited to Yerushalayim. You can't eat it b'chol mashvasechem in all your dwelling places, and so therefore you can fulfill your obligation of matzah with Ma'aser Sheni in all its forms. The Mishnah then said that if somebody had designated these matzahs for the mincha offerings, whether it is a Thanksgiving mincha offering or it is a Nazir mincha offering, you could fulfill your obligation of matzah with it if you had intended to sell it. Meaning you made these for the marketplace. You're a baker. You made some matzah knowing that there are a lot of people coming up for Aliyah L'Regel, for pilgrimage. They're coming up and they are bringing all their obligations that they have outstanding for the year for karbanos. And so you say, okay, there's probably a few people that have to bring a Toda offering because they had been gravely ill and became better, or they had been taken captive and they came out. So they're going to need some Toda offerings. So you make bread to sell. You make these matzahs to sell to the marketplace for chalas Toda. As the Gemara is going to tell us later, you know that potentially you're not going to sell it, and therefore you intend also to make it for matzah, therefore for the mitzvah of matzah, and therefore you can fulfill the obligation. However, if you yourself have an obligation of a Toda offering or a Nazah offering, and you made this bread, these matzahs, as your particular matzah or breads for your Toda offering or the Nazir offering, then you cannot fulfill the obligation of matzah on the night of Pesach with this. And the Gemara says, Minani Mili. How do we know this, that you cannot fulfill your obligation with matzah? It's kosher matzah. You just intended to make it for a carbon and never ended up bringing it that way. Amar Rabba, so Rabba said, Amakra, it says in the verse, it says in the pasuk, and we turn to Lamed Ches Amid Beis, Ushmartem es hamatzos. You have to guard the matzah from becoming chametz. You have to have an intentional protection of this matzah. The Gemara says, matzah hamishtameres l'shem matzah. That means you have to guard it with the intention of matzah. When you go to a matzah bakery, everybody working there, from the beginning of the dough, of kneading the dough, all the way to the end, people working are constantly saying, L'shem mitzvahs matzah. I'm doing this with the intent of the mitzvah of matzah. There has to be a specific intent for matzah. Yatzazu she'emish tameres l'shem matzah. But this was not fulfilled. This is not guarded for the mitzvah of matzah, even though you did guard it from becoming chametz, but it's for the mitzvah of karban, for the mitzvah of the mincha offering of the Toda or the Nazir. Elo l'shem zevach. And so the guarding that you guard also has to be with the intent of mitzvah, of matzah. Rav Yosef says, no, the source is a different source. Amakra, it says in the pasuk, Shivas yamim matzahs techelu. You have to make the matzah with the intent of matzah for 7 days. And this matzah, you actually are intending for it to only be for 1 day, because a carbon has a limit after the day of the carbon. It's going to be considered leftovers. Shivas yamim matzahs techelu. Matzah nechelas shivas yamim matzazu shein nechelas shivas yamim. That excludes this. It's not eaten for 7 days. Ela l'yom v'layla, only for a day and a night, and you're intending to eat this matzah only for a day and for a day and a night. Tani Kavasi, the Rabbi and Tani Kavasi Rabbi Yosef, and we have it's seemingly a brisa concurring with each one of these explanations, interpretations. Tani Kavasi the Rabbi. We have a brisa like Rabbi that says the source is because it has to be guarded for the sake of matzah. Perhaps the person can fulfill the obligation of matzah the first night of Pesach with breads, these matzahs, made for the korban, for a mincha offering that comes along with the Toda offering, or for the mincha offering that comes with a nazir. Therefore, the Torah says, and you shall guard the matzah. Matzah mishameres l'shem matzah. And matzah has to be guarded for the sake of matzah. And these breads, they are guarded from becoming chametz on account of the offering, because they belong to a korban, and not because they are for the obligation of matzah. Tanik Avaseder of Yosef, and we have a brisa that concurs with Rav Yosef. Perhaps a person can fulfill his obligation with chalas toda, the breads that come along with the Toda offering, or kikei nazir, or the mincha that comes along with the nazir, and nazir offering. Therefore, it says 7 days you shall eat matzah nechelas shiva. It has to be matzah that when you intend to guard it from keeping from becoming chametz, you intend for matzah, but you intend not only for matzah, but for the 7 days of matzah. This too has to be eaten you have to be guarded for 7 days. And since you're only guarding it with the intent of eating it for 7 days, you're intending to only eat this for a day because you're making it for a carbon for the offering of Nazir or the offering of the Todah, and they have a limit. They can only be eaten for this limited time, the day and the night, and then when the morning comes, it's considered leftovers and it's prohibited. Leftovers are carbon and prohibited. So that's why the Mishnah says if you had intended it for your own carbon, so then you didn't guard it for the sake of matzah, and even if you did, but you didn't guard it for the sake of matzah for 7 days, so it's not going to count as you cannot fulfill the obligation with this. So Gemara says, okay, so you said the reason is because it's not guarded for the sake of matzah to be eaten for 7 days. But we have a more original source that we've already seen earlier. Rabbi Yossi Aglili said that the reason you can't eat Meiser Sheni, the second tithe, as your matzah, which we just said Rabbi Akiva holds differently, and you can fulfill your obligation with Meiser Sheni, the second tithe, but Rabbi Yossi Aglili said you cannot. And the basis for that was because this is a bread of affliction. And you can't use something that is meant to be eaten with joy and happiness, and you can't eat the affliction bread that way. Misha nechal ba'aninas has to be bread that's edible when in mourning. And the carbon also has to be eaten b'simcha. So this Bryce said, you're right. According to Rabbi Yossi Galili, this would be a source to say that you can't eat the carbon bread this way either. But Rabbi Akiva disagreed with that drash, and Rabbi Akiva said, no, this doesn't count as eating ba'aninus. This doesn't count as eating matzah in sadness in mourning. You're eating the matzah in happiness. You just happen to be eating the matzah in happiness. But the bread is called the bread is called ani. It's poor man's bread, and that what we say that means is that you can't add oil and wine or nectar or honey to the bread, to the matzah. It has to be just flour and water. So that's what Rabbi Akiva says the meaning of lechem ani. So. This is not going to be a contradiction to this simcha. We're joyous, we're happy at the Seder, and it's not going to be considered eating it in aninas in mourning. And this is not going to be a limit here. So the lechem oni is not telling you that this is called affliction. Fine. So you said, the Gemara says, okay, so according to Rabbi Akiva, what did we say the limits are? That you can't eat, the matzah has to be made of flour and water. Well, one of the ingredients of a mincha offering is that it needs oil. You add oil to the mincha offering. And so it's not poor man's bread anymore. It has oil in it. Now, how much oil? In Amar Shmuel, Abar Rav Yitzchak, reviasi. It takes a revius, let's say about 3 ounces. Umischalekasi lekama chalas. And if you remember, we talked about that for the Todah offering, there were 4 sets of 10 breads, and the set even in the amount of oil you bring is a half a lug, and that half a lug is divided into a quarter lug, about 3 ounces, to the 10 breads, and to the 10 rikikin. So to 2 of the types get each one an eighth of a log, meaning 1.5 ounces approximately each, divided into 10 breads of each, and in the one type, the revucha, that gets a full 3 ounces for the 10 breads. But either way, we're talking about a lot of bread with a tiny drop of oil in each one, and that's not going to invalidate it. But typically, the inan echalos b'chol meshavis. So the Gemara says, okay, So, but it's not eaten b'chol mashavos in all your dwelling places, because the halacha is that a challah offering is the Toda offering has to be eaten in like kachim, and another offering as well. These have to be eaten in inside the walls of Yerushalayim. But as the pasuk says, "V'achalta lefnei Hashem," you have to eat it in front of Hashem. You have to eat it in Yerushalayim. So it's not eating. It's not eaten everywhere. And this is not like Ma'aser Sheni that once it became tummy, you can take it out. So why do I need a special teaching of the Torah to tell me that you have to guard the matzahs for the sake of matzah, and if you guarded it for the sake of a carbon, it doesn't. You can't fulfill your mitzvah with it. When in any case I can't, because it's not limited. It's limited to Yerushalayim. It's not something I can bring even to my home. I can't eat it at home. Amar Rish Lakish. So Rish Lakish says you're right. Once the Beis Hamikdash came, once the temple was built in Yerushalayim, the Beis Hamikdash was built, you cannot eat it anywhere other than in Yerushalayim. However, prior to that, we had the Mishkan. We had in Nov and Givon, there was a temporary dwelling, a temporary Kodesh place. There, the halacha was that there wasn't a wall around that city. And if you didn't have to eat it in the courtyard of the Beis Hamikdash, so then you were allowed to take it home and eat it. And that tells us that the challah and the toda, the challah of the toda and of the nazir, in the times of the of Nov and Givon, of the Beis Hamikdash, the Mishkan in Nov and Givon, they were allowed to be eaten anywhere. And for that time of during that era, we needed a teaching to tell us that even though you can take these breads home and eat them anywhere, nevertheless, you don't fulfill the obligation, because it's not with the intent of matzah, it's with the intent of a carbon. Tanya, we have a brayso. The brayso says that Rabbi Lai asked Rabbi Eliezer, can a person fulfill his obligation with the breads that were made for a carbon, a Thanksgiving offering, a Toda offering, or another offering? Amar li, and he responded to me, Lo Shamati. I never heard that. Basi v'shaltis Rabbi Yeshua. So I went and asked Rabbi Yeshua. Amar li, he said to me, Hare amru chalas Toda rikika nazir sha'asan la'atzmei and adam yesidei chavasei, that we learned our Mishnah, that if you intended with these to be the fulfillment of your obligatory carbon, so then you intended for when you bake these breads for yourself, for the carbon, not for them guarding it for matzah, so you don't fulfill with it. But limkar b'shuk, but if you intended to sell it in the marketplace, then you can fulfill with these breads. Now, so Rabbi Eli says, I went back to Rabbi Eliezer and told him this. Rabbi Eliezer, he said, the two versions in the intonation of how he said this. First said, bris, oh yes, by the covenant, meaning a promise. These are exactly the words that we have in tradition were given to Moshe at Sinai. Ikadamri, that those that say no, he didn't say it as in a statement, he said it in a question. Bris, is this something we can take an oath about? Is this some tradition from Sinai? Or do we need a reasoning why there would be a distinction? If you made it for yourself, you can not fulfill the mitzvah of Pesach, of matzah with it, and if you're selling it in the market, you can't. Wouldn't we require an explanation? So what is the reason? Amarabba, as we explained earlier, if you made it to sell in the market, you know you may not sell it. And therefore, if you're going to have leftovers, what are you going to do with it? So when you baked it, you intended, I'll either eat this at the Seder, if it's leftovers, and if not, we'll sell it. I will eat it myself and fulfill the mitzvah with it.